Our tax system still siphons out of the private economy too large a share of personal and business purchasing power and reduces the incentive for risk, investment, and effort, thereby aborting our recoveries and stifling our national growth rate. This is from John F. Kennedy in 1963, and sadly it can still be applied to our predicament today. We simply said that our tax system is stifling our economy and growth rate by hampering the corporations in the United States with an outrageous corporate income tax rate. If you lower the tax rate, we will make the United States more attractive to investment, as well as increase the wages of the workers within the United States. Now with that, let's be going over the arguments that Grayson brought up in his last speech. Starting off with the criterion, I'd just like to point out that the affirmative team does agree that we need to uphold the stock issues, but as to, at this point in the round, both teams do agree on the criterion of economic efficiency. Now let's move on to his harm under the, or his response under the harm. He had one response to our entire harm, and that was that the effective rate is 22%. I have 3 responses to this. The first one, actually 4 responses, sorry. The first one is that it is a small, or a single deduction, single deductions. Now let's look to a piece of evidence from the Cato Institute, Dunhai Chen, who is a PhD in economics and had a postdoc in Yale, and he's about to say that what really lowers the effective rate is one-time deductions that corporations get when they're just starting out, and that lowers the average effective tax rate. This is in February of 2011, and it says, quote, under the temporary U.S. rules, businesses may deduct 100% of the cost of new capital and equipment in the fiscal year. We calculate that this provision reduces the U.S. effective tax rate to as low as 17.5%, but this is only a single-year windfall. It does not create certainty for businesses in their capital planning. So when the negative team quotes evidence talking about the low effective rate, a large portion of that is due to single-year tax breaks and does not reflect the long-term breaks that the companies get. Let's look to my second response. You can tag as a small impact. Deductions have small impact on the effective tax rate. This is from Scott Hodge, who's the president of the Tax Foundation. And he says, quote, in August of 2010, while it is true that these corporate tax expenditures are quite important to some firms and industries, they do not appear to have a major impact on lowering the overall amount of income taxes corporations pay, nor the effective rate at which they ultimately pay. So essentially, the deductions don't have a large effect on the overall amount that the companies pay. Let's look to my third response. Again, this is to harm one, his response. My third response is that of 34.6%. So even if this didn't matter, let's look at what the effective rate actually is. This is from the Cato Institute in February of 2011. It says, quote, should Japan cut its corporate tax rate in April as planned, the U.S. statutory rate of about 40%, including federal and state taxes, will be the highest in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The U.S. effective rate of 34.6% is far higher than the average of the 33 OECD nations and a full group of 83 nations. So what we see is that the effective rate in the United States is extremely high. And just for your information, the OECD is an acronym that probably both teams will refer to a certain amount in today's debate round. It stands for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a group of 33 industrialized nations in the world, and studies are done on it, and it can really be applied to the United States because they're similar economies, just for your clarification. And then my fourth and final response to harm one, you can tag, is that the impacts remain. Now this is probably the most important argument, or most important response. Even if the effective rate was 2% or 1%, the impacts to the tax rate still remain. If you look at our harm, specifically under the subpoint of wages lower, the evidence said that for every $10 billion brought in by the corporate income tax, wages are decreased by $43.5 billion. Now the key thing here is that that is contingent on the amount of revenue brought in by the corporate income tax and has nothing to do with the effective rate. What we see, at least at this point in the round, is that the corporate income tax brings in $180 billion of revenue and is lowering wages dramatically. Let's move on to the solvency point that he brought up across from the plan. Solvency point number 1 was that the rate is not met. And my response is simple, and my response is simply that we do not claim a revenue increase. He was talking about the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve is an economist, or Laffer is an economist that thinks that if you lower the corporate income tax rate, the revenue might increase because of dynamic responses in the economy. The affirmative team, however, is not claiming that. We realize that some revenue will be lost, but we believe that the money is better spent in the private sector than in the government. It's simply a drop in the bucket, and to promote economic efficiency, we believe that the corporations should have more finances on hand. Let's look to his point under this, and that was of the state rates. My response is that the state rates are from 2 to 5%. This is from Rob Norton, who's an author writing for Fortune magazine in 2008, and it says, quote, "State levies further income taxes on corporations at rates generally ranging from 3 to 12%, but states typically permit deductions for federal taxes paid. The net rate ranges from 1.9 to 4.9%. So it is true that Pennsylvania does have about a 10% income tax, but when you take into account the deductions, the companies are only paying about 5%, which I'd like to point out does fall in line with the average of the 4.2% that we presented in our 1AC. Let's move on to the advantages. Now I had a couple of responses. The first one was under the advantage under the heritage card. He had two responses. The first was that that of the federal rate, and the second was that it was a flawed study. My first response is that it was a total burden. If you look at the evidence, it says that the total corporate income tax burden is such and such, and it was talking about the total burden on the corporations in the United States. That includes federal and state rates. My second response is that this was not a specific indictment. The evidence that they read was simply from a source that doesn't like the Heritage Foundation. It wasn't a specific indictment to the corporate income tax, and more importantly, it wasn't specific to the study that we actually quoted. If they're going to be indicting sources, they need to indict specifically the study, not just read from people that don't like the Heritage Foundation. Now let's move on to the solvency point that he brought under this, and that was that of the wrong focus, talking about how the corporations are sitting on cash and how there's a shortage of demand. My first response is that we agree that demand is crucial. My second response is that demand will increase. Now think about it. What causes people to buy products? What causes demand to increase? What causes that is the amount of money in their pockets. In fact, they actually said that. They said that they aren't satisfied with their paychecks. How do you increase their paychecks? You increase it by increasing their wages. Look at our let's look at a piece of evidence talking about how the corporate income tax is actually directly linked to wages. This is from Lawrence J. Klotnikoff, who is a PhD from Harvard, and it says, "There is good reason to believe that it is workers, not the owners of corporations, who ultimately pay much of, if not all, of the corporate income tax. And not just workers employed by corporations, all workers throughout the economy." So essentially, he's saying that the workers are the ones that pay the corporate income tax because they can simply pass it on to the workers by lowering their wages. Let's look at another piece of evidence under this from the same source, and it says, quote, "If the United States cut its corporate income tax rate, the country would likely experience a huge rise in net domestic investment, which is now running on a post-low war of 4%. This would potentially raise U.S. workers' wages dramatically by as much as 10%. So demand will increase when the wages of the workers are increased. And how will they be increased? They will be increased by cutting the corporate income tax, as this PhD from Harvard supports. Let's look on to my next point, and that was about the companies sitting on trillions of dollars. My response is simply that the companies are in debt right now. We can bring up further evidence if they press us to do that. And then he also talked about how the wages are unaffected. I'd like to point out that the evidence that he read supporting this said nothing about the corporate income tax, and if you look at historical precedent, wages are affected directly by the corporate income tax. For all these reasons, I would strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Greg, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Grayson. How are you?
Got a couple questions for you. I'm doing great.
Okay.
First off, can I get my evidence back? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now let's just talk briefly about your criterion. Economic efficiency, this essentially means whoever grows the economy best, correct?
Yeah, pretty much. Whoever creates a more efficient economy, GDP, etc.
Okay. All right. Now your first response to my argument of the effective rate was that it's a one-time thing when you start the business, correct?
I just gave an example of one deduction that causes the effective rate to decrease dramatically.
Oh, so that's
a single-time windfall.
Oh, so that's just one example.
That was one example, but the one example said that alone can cause the effective rate to go down to 17.5%.
Okay.
So essentially, the effective rate is affected by one-time deductions, not necessarily. The point is the companies aren't going to be paying the 17.5% forever, just for a one-time.
All right. Now you read these statements from the Cato Institute about the effective rate. Can we take a look at that piece of evidence?
Yes. And the credentials are on another piece of evidence.
Okay, did I get the credentials?
Yeah. Here. Actually, they're right here. Yeah, the same URL credentials. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, thank you. Now you made the argument under the Solvency 1 that corporations need more finances on hand, correct?
I don't believe I made that argument.
Well, you said it.
I don't.
You said it as you read, right?
Saying that.
Okay. Well,
yeah, sorry.
Okay. Well, with that in mind, let's just jump down to the record profits argument. You said that corporations are in debt.
Yes.
Okay. How much are they in debt?
As of a piece of evidence at the table, $7.2 trillion.
Okay, and this is talking about all U.S. corporations?
It is talking about corporations in the United States.
Okay, so if you give them more money, what do you think they're going to do?
If we give them more money, well, right now they're in debt, and so if the corporations get more money, their capital becomes more mobile, which means they're more likely to increase wages, et cetera, which has been proven historically.
All right. Now let's turn to the Heritage Foundation. Do you think that think tanks change their economic model?
Actually, no. Think tanks are a pretty... Oh, their economic model?
Yeah.
Yes, they do, yeah.
Okay, did you have any evidence for that?
No, think tanks are... they're essentially progressing as time goes on, trying to improve their model, et cetera, et cetera. They don't just make up a model.
Did you bring up any evidence justifying the heritage economic model?
Well, you didn't bring any specifically denying the model or the study that we read.
Okay, all right.
We can bring up additional evidence to this point from non-heritage sources if you really want us to, but my point was that it wasn't a specific index.
All right, thanks. Now, why do you believe that your plan is going to increase wages? It's simply because corporations are going to have more money.
There's a lot of reasons. Historically, when the corporate income tax rate has been cut...
Okay, I only have 30 seconds left, so can you answer my question? I have one more after that.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So is it because corporations are going to have more money?
Corporations are going to, the money that they're getting from the tax breaks or from the lower corporate income tax rate will be easily passed on to their workers through wages.
Okay, and then finally you made the argument that corporations are able to pay the corporate tax rate by paying out lower wages, correct?
Yes, they cut the wages of their workers.
Okay, could I get evidence?
Wait, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
Evidence?
The evidence?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why the corporation...
Right, no, could I have the evidence?
I believe it's in the one you see under Harm 1 subpoint A.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah.